But right now, I'd like to introduce again Professor Ernest Drucker, who's going to talk about mass incarceration within an epidemiological framework.
Thank you. Hi. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time, actually, at University of Michigan, although I've had friends here over the years. And I'm really pleased to see the level of interest and sophistication, from my point of view, in how to look at this. And part of that, for me, has been the use of the epidemiological tool from public health as a way of examining and interrogating this phenomenon of mass incarceration. So this is shameless self-promotion for my book. It will be out in paperback in May, June with an additional 10,000-word afterward, which brings it up to date because it went to press about 3.5 years ago. And as Mark mentioned, there have been a lot of recent changes that are very important, both on the positive and the negative end. I'll talk a bit about that. So the public health model of this phenomenon, which jumps out at you, and you don't have to be an epidemiologist to look at this and say, well, what's going on? Something happened. And to dig into that and see what the details of that change are and what they signify has been my purpose. Mark mentioned this, the United States position internationally, in addition to that swooping increase, which says what happened, what does that mean, also relative to locating this phenomenon in the larger context of other changes in the world. I thought that Anna's presentation about the Institute of Medicine reports and the disparities in the United States health status in many ways are inextricably linked to this phenomenon. Mark mentioned that there are 500,000 people in American prisons for drug offenses, which means violations of having or buying and selling drugs, not being a drug kingpin, not having hit someone over the head to get money for drugs, but actually the possession, sales and small-scale sales, obviously, of drugs put 500,000 people. That's more than all the people in prison for all offenses in the European Union, which has over 400 million people in it, and plenty of problems of their own. So to give you a sense of how much of an outlier the United States is. And that's another thing epidemiologically that calls attention. So remember, what makes an epidemic is not that it's something new, it's that there's something there's a lot more of suddenly. And the question of why that is always leads you back to interventions because like medicine, which is where public health sits historically, it's an interventionist intent. You know, it's meant to do something about it, not, oh, how interesting it all is. So having said that, I want to compare what's a public health model and not. And part of it is very deeply rooted in the system of criminal justice, criminal law, the concept of crime and punishment, which is a supremely individual model. So a single case of a disease is an individual phenomenon. Risks are from causal agents, etiology, pathophysiology, what's the biology of this disease. The course of the disease is determined by host factors and environment, the biological circumstances that promote your acquiring an illness and how it progresses in you, and intervention is based on individual diagnosis and treatment, and individual outcomes are what it's all about. We've all been patients. We all will be. So that's a very coherent model. But when you apply it to medicine, it makes a lot of sense. When you apply it to criminal justice, within the law, each case is decided on its own merits. A sentence is meted out based on whatever policies have been there, right or wrong. But it's a highly individual model. And in fact, historically, the courts are not interested in sociological studies about the phenomenon which this case represents. So there's a case in the papers and news today about a man who just got out of prison after 42 years for something he didn't do. He was put in prison when he was 16 years old for a fire down in, where was it? I want to say Alabama, Arizona is where it was. The fire killed 30 people, and this 16-year-old, they got a confession out of him and didn't have to look any further. And it took 42 years for the facts to emerge that someone else had done it, in fact, had confessed to it and been verified to have been there. And the criminal justice system couldn't find it in its heart to go and get this guy out. A judge had to do it. One of the Innocence Projects in Arizona. Then, so if you look at the numbers in the Innocence Projects around the country, looking at DNA evidence and looking at it more closely recently, very few of those people who are exonerated get compensated for having been wrongfully convicted. That gives you a sense of the attitude of the system. It does not admit to wrongdoing. Prosecutors are not liable to suit for their own failures, unless they rise to the level of criminality of prosecutorial misconduct, in which prosecutors can be prosecuted, but rarely are. And then if you've worked in the criminal justice system, understand it is not the judge that is the pinnacle of that system, it's the prosecution. They run the system and they control everything in it. So it's not surprising that looking at mass incarceration, one of the engines of that is a 95% a plea rate rather than trial rate for indigent defendants. It's systems like a sausage factory. And it has filled up the prisons over this course of this last 40 years. Now, a public health model, by contrast, and I'll talk a bit about the individual effects, but the public health model of mass incarceration, as any epidemic, is a social phenomenon. It's not about the individuals, it's about the sum of the individuals. An epidemiologist from the CDC said recently to me, it's about the herd, it's not about the cow. And someone has to pay attention to that, especially in this country at this time, where there's a fundamental set of doubts and questions and confusions about the social responsibility and the social role and the social task that, when every time a Katrina comes along or a Sandy, people remember, oh yeah, where's the government? But generally, it's been discredited. The money that should go to that goes to the 1%, and so it's not there for the food programs, for the housing programs, that other social democracies to which we're compared dedicate themselves. And that's why the tax rates are slightly different in Sweden and England and France. They're only slightly different when you add them all up, 5-10% the most. But that guarantees the social safety net that is rapidly disappearing in this country. So the public health model of mass incarceration looks at it as a social phenomenon. It asks risks that affect distribution and determinants of disease, the fundamental idea of public health in populations, and that the interventions are meant to affect the environment of risk that affect the collectivity, and with outcomes based on incidence and prevalence rates for populations, not for individuals. So it's simple as that is, that's a fundamental difference. It has little place in criminal law. It has a primary place in our looking at the population of any society and its health status, which is what we hear about. So now, obviously, every prisoner is both an individual case facing personal risks and consequences of incarceration and a member of the larger picture. So both things are going on at once, and there's no point in making believe that's not true. And we need to pay attention to both. We need, the kid comes into an emergency room with a rat bite. You got to treat the rat bite and give him antibiotics, but somebody better go to the house and find out why there are rats there and deal with that. And that's a public health test. So I'm saying there's not a contrast between these things. They're complementary, but there's no question that this collective role, this public health dimension, has gotten short shrift, even as it's taken over the stage. Now, the individual effects of imprisonment, Mark has touched on a number of those effects and the circumstances leading to individual imprisonment, and of course that's the unit that drives this forward. The physical and mental health effects of incarceration are profound, especially since the withdrawal of the kinds of rehabilitative services where there was an intent to produce a better person who'd come out of prison and would be able to go back to the community. All the indications are that, although there are always people who stand up as poster children for how they found themselves in prison, but that's generally not the case. There are very few people who recommend going to prison as a way to improve your life. And any of you who've worked in prisons understand why that is. One of the ways of looking at it is the economics. Basically, for every prison bed, there's a job. And that's what's called the prison industrial complex. The heart of it is that what's bad for one population is employing another population. Now, family and community ties that are affected by incarceration are very profound. You're going to hear some of the wonderful work that Chris Wildman has done, has been looking at effects of parental incarceration on families and children in some very surprising ways, which you'll hear about. Life course prospects, the likelihood, the work of Bruce Western and Becky Pettit here, who's worked with him on looking at these life course effects on fundamental things like likelihood of marriage, successful marriage, having a home, having a job, being able to serve in the military, all these individual effects on the prisoner, which have the effect of essentially weakening their ability to function in the society upon discharge from prison. There's not you show me a single study that shows a better prospect for any population that's been in prison than if they hadn't gone. And you begin to get some opportunity to actually, for the epidemiologists here, to study this prospectively, which is the strongest way, in the fact that you're beginning to have people not go to prison for crimes they used to go to prison for. It had been the other way for 35 years. But in New York State, which Mark mentioned, beginning to remove the mandatory sentencing for a number of low-level drug felony offenses has already produced 8,000 fewer people in prison in New York State from just 2 felony offenses that had mandatory removed. The judge could still give them 15 years, but once they didn't have to give them the 15 years, suddenly they were drug courts and alternatives to incarceration. So you begin to have a quasi-experimental design, for those of you who are methodologists, which lets you follow out what happens to people who don't go to prison who otherwise would. In fact, we're just completing a study for the NIJ at Vera Institute and John Jay, looking at a comparison group of 100 people before the reform that let these 2 felony offenses go without mandatory sentences, and a pre-reform group which did go, and we'll give you the results of those when we have them. And of course, the recidivism of the system, which is another clue to its infectious nature. Because when I talk about this as an epidemic, I don't mean an epidemic like obesity with increasing risk for chronic disease, but more like an infectious disease epidemic. And I was surprised myself as I got into this because as an epidemiologist, everything looks like an epidemic. But it's a bit of a metaphor. But as you get into it, it's surprising the degree in which you can see transmissive elements of it going on. One of them being this intergenerational phenomenon of children and families, and we'll hear more about that from Chris. But mass incarceration, my main concern here, the collective side of it, we're going to apply the basic, the trinity of time, place, and person. So does that analysis yield anything useful to our understanding? Does it point us in the direction of models of intervention to do something about the problems? And I include in those the problems of crime. So first one, time, and it's the growth of the U.S. incarceration epidemic, which Mark showed you the picture of. Can I grab some of this water? And I thank Alan Beck and Al Blumstein, actually, for some of the slides on this, which are much better than mine. And this is part 1 of the story, and it's just as important as part 2. It's just as important as the slope. In the 100 years before the slope, really going back to 1880, we have data in New York State, you have a pretty constant rate of population incarceration, fluctuating between 75 and 150 per 100,000. Different in different states, different at different moments in that history. But that 100 years, 1880 to 1975 or so, a lot of different things went on in the country. The Depression, race riots, enormous immigration, movements of migrations of populations, not a stable kind of situation like you might have in some older European democracies. And yet, the use of imprisonment, don't think about crime, just the use of imprisonment is remarkably constant through that period. And then suddenly it shifts, and you immediately say, what happened at that time? And Mark referred to this. And that's part of what I want to address as one of the ways of understanding what the epidemiology of it is. And you can see that these trends carrying into the present are that the state system has leveled off, but the federal system continues to grow, and grow in a particularly pernicious way in relation to things like immigration and sex offenses, with the privatization of the prisons for immigration being a central feature of the ability to rapidly expand the use of that detention system, which violates many of our own rules of how defendants should be treated. They're not citizens. And now that gets complicated by the recent immigration reform and the political pressures around that. I have no idea where that's going to go, but be aware that in that context, the federal system of prisons continues to expand. This spaghetti is the fact that there are tremendous variations in states. These are the states' growth in prisons during this time. And you can see with North Dakota and Maine at the bottom, and Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas up on top as the highest growth rates of imprisonment. And it's certainly with Texas, one of the biggest systems. Louisiana, one of the most ferocious systems. There are about 1 in 6 people in Louisiana prisons will die in prison if you look at their life expectancy. Not because they have life sentences, but because the sentences are so long that their natural life expectancy will run out before their prison sentences will. So a lot of geriatric phenomena going on in prisons with huge implications of costs and vulnerability to the absence of good medical care. Elderly population is very sensitive to that, but big differences. So there are even 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that allow prisoners to vote while in prison. And there's been too little examination of that, what's behind that and how it works. New York State, where I've worked and have the most data from, is an important model of this for a number of reasons. So you can see the jump that takes place in New York is very similar to that which took place nationally. In fact, it's the trigger, or the outbreak, if you like. And this is Nelson Rockefeller. 1973 is the day of the Rockefeller drug laws, which were the embodiment of the tough on crime and mandatory sentencing practice. And independent of any criminological or public safety issues, the significance of Rockefeller is that it demonstrated the political utility and the political value of the tough on crime position. There's an earlier work about this book by Khalil Muhammad, The Condemnation of Blackness. I want to recommend this important book. Khalil is the head of the Schomburg Center for Race Studies of Race in New York Public Library in New York City. And this is a book that goes back to the post-Civil War, the Reconstruction period, and the development of the criminalization of the black population in the United States, the condemnation of blackness, he calls it, name of the book. And you see the roots of our current system and the racial disparities in it, not just in practice, but interpretation, what it signifies about a whole race of people, and how that carries into the present. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But the Rockefeller drug laws, were the poster child for the whole country. Other states imitated them very rapidly. The federal government did, because politicians could not help but notice that as they took this position, they did well politically. And the ones who didn't take this position were characterized as soft on crime, soft on drugs, were jumped on, and never was seen again in political life. Whereas it became a quick path to success. And a large proportion of people who go into electoral politics start their careers as prosecutors. So they had the ability to make their bones in the system while they were enacting these early years of the war on drugs especially. And you can see that in the New York State data, that the drug offenders became an increasingly large part of the population. Mark mentioned the numbers that had been in jail for drug offense and what they are today, but also you could see the rise of this at exactly the moment that the epidemic burst. And understanding the recidivism and the role of recidivism and predicate offenses, which lead to higher sentences later on, 3 strikes being the model of that these drug admissions to the system have a lot of meaning besides that particular admission. They predict another admission and a readmission or a recidivism. And New York State demonstrated that very clearly. Race and ethnicity, so that was the time dimension. You can see these different factors changing over the time of the epidemic. The next dimension is person, the who. It's like a news story, what, when, where, who. And the who is very important because that's the individual differences not by which person versus which person, but which social group versus which social group. And you can see that there was always a serious disparity in incarceration of blacks and whites in New York State, 3 or 4 to 1, but that jumps to 12 or 13 to 1 in the epoch of mass incarceration. And you can see it most graphically in the rates per 100,000 incarceration for the high-risk group of males 21 to 44, 38 per 100,000 of whites, 1,600, a 40-fold, 40-fold difference in risk of incarceration for black men in New York State in this period. Similar statistics available from almost every state in the Union for this period. And when you have differences, odds ratios of that kind of magnitude, they immediately call attention to themselves to ask, why is this happening? So in the case of drug offenses, these RDLs, Rockefeller drug laws, so these are drug offenders. And we have pretty good evidence that there's no regular difference in the level of drug use of blacks and whites in America. It changes from time to time, from drug to drug, from place to place, but there's no consistent pattern that would say, oh, well, the reason there are more black people in prison is because, for drugs, it's because they use drugs more than white people. It's simply not true. But if you were to watch television and see the shows that demonstrate the raids and the busts and the people being marched out of prison, the perp walks, those are black faces all the time. And the drug kingpins, of course, that's supposed to be the target of all this, there aren't enough drug kingpins in the world to fill a single prison. So this disparity is driven by something else. It manifests itself in the lifetime risk, which keeps accelerating all the time. That this is earlier data showing a 28%. Mark pointed out it's up into the 30s at this point. So you think about what it means in your own family if men in your family had a 35% risk of going to prison, and if you think about it hard, it's called Washington D.C. Because there's data that if there are 35% or 40% that have someone in prison or have been in prison or under control of the system right now, the lifetime risk in D.C. is close to 95%. Harry Bell, I had the slide that has a little speech by Harry on it that he did at the NAACP Image Awards, in which he pointed out that this shame of America, the incarceration of black people, is something that very few black leadership people are willing to talk about. I gave a talk at the plenary session of the Urban League in Pittsburgh about 5-6 years ago about this, and nobody came. This is not something that the Urban League is famous as the glass is half full approach to racial problems in the United States, and this is not something that they want to think about. And I think Becky Pettit's work shows the expression of that in the disappearance of this population's data about health from the consideration of the progress of the black population, the supposed progress of the black population in the U.S. And I think President Obama has a certain level of blame for that. No excuses, I think, is the motto. Well, there are some excuses necessary for what's happened here. And Harry Belafonte said in that talk that he gave at the end of the Image Awards that where are the churches, he said. Where are the community leaders speaking out about this issue? Thank you. So place, finally, the concentration geographically has tremendous significance because it means that everybody in the social networks, these are the hot neighborhoods, the feeder neighborhoods, we call them in New York City, which account for about 85% of all the imprisonment from New York City, and have generated, this is what the Bronx, where I worked, looked like in '75. It's a little bit better now. But prisoners by block, the $1 million blocks, really up to $5 million blocks now. We're over $1 million is being spent on incarcerating people from a single block. And translate that into what the $1 million would mean in social workers, nurses, aides, kindergarten teachers, people to repair the elevators, the projects, things like that, things that might be useful to the future of a community, rather than the public safety argument, because it's often argued, well, it's the people in those communities that are the victims of crime, and they're the ones who want the cops out doing stop and frisk. And this is one way that brings it all together. This is a three-dimensional picture of what I call the tsunami of mass incarceration as it sweeps over the birth cohorts. And those of you who think about birth cohorts, when a group of people that are born in a certain year, as they mature out, what's their destiny? And this is the United States as a whole, where we go from about under 2% of a lifetime risk of incarceration to about 7% now. It's getting higher. And as that sweeps over communities, physically, demographically, ethnically, and racially, it leaves a tremendous swath of damage in its wake. Okay, punishment versus public health. We're working on a conference at John Jay now called From Punishment to Public Health, and are really challenged to turn that into real recommendations. What are the pathways to prison? What preventive measures do we need to take? If we turn our idea from crime prevention to reduction of incarceration, what are the strategies for doing that? And I want to talk about that a bit. Let me skip over this because we're running out of time. The point here being that a lot of people go to prison as a consequence of administrative failures of their parole because no one gets out of prison without having some parole obligation, and those are often the reasons that people go back to prison rather than a new crime. So stopping the epidemic of mass incarceration, if it is indeed an epidemic, what do we do to stop it and then roll it back? And the model in public health is primary, secondary, and tertiary. And those who took Public Health 101 know that primary means prevent the cases from happening. Secondary means limit the harms that are associated with. You can't cure the person in some case, but you can, with diabetes, let's say, or heart disease, but they can have a much better or worse life depending on whether, and more of it, depending on whether they get treatment or not. So secondary prevention is basically treatment. And tertiary prevention, there's no treatment. A person has lost their limb, they're blind, whatever it is. Their quality of life, the degree of disability, and especially in an aging population, tertiary prevention becomes a very, very important aspect of the obligation of public health prevention. Remember, public health is a preventive, as a branch of medicine, it's a preventive branch. So primary prevention is reducing the number arrested and imprisoned. Community restoration, law and sentencing reform, reentry services to prevent recidivism, housing, jobs, education, all the things that we know about already. The thing is, it's not enough to know about them. You actually have to do them. And you have to do them at scale. You can't keep doing endless pilot projects funded by some foundation of rich people who decide that they'd like to have their name associated with progressive activity they can have a dinner about. When you have a stream of 8 to 12 million people who have been through this system, who have been damaged by it in individual ways that show up in their life expectancy, their children's life expectancy, you need a lot of effort devoted to that. If you look at the wake of this period of mass incarceration and take the 8 to 10 million individuals who have been in prison in the last 30 years, and each of them has a family, fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, husbands, wives, children, you get to be a big 30, 40 million, that kind of number. And nothing that we're doing comes close to addressing that scale. Community restoration is an important part. Here's the newer picture of the Bronx, which is coming out, and a lot of it has to do with real estate values in New York City. The unaffordable neighborhoods keep expanding out into first Brooklyn and now the Bronx, which are convenient for subway, and they make a difference because they shift the population. They shift the population to more distant and more remote areas, like Rockaway, which got inundated recently by Sandy. But here's the new Bronx. Drug law reforms, Mark mentioned these. The Rockefeller drug laws, in fact, began to, as soon as they were passed, it was evident that they weren't doing any good. The heroin epidemic had passed in large part because of the advent of methadone treatment in New York City, and yet the laws kept piling up people because they were the political value got traction, and it didn't matter that the problem had abated. And then along came the crack epidemic and the crack babies. But if you look at this chart, which shows the changes in New York State system, the red line on top being arrests, the green one being indictments, the blue being commitments to prison, you can see the shift began in the late 80s, actually. The most recent changes in 2009, which took away the mandatory sentence of certain drug felonies, also at the same time reduced the narcotics police force of New York City from 2,800 to 1,100, and that was the driving force for buy and bust operations, which were the most that's the Wire, that model of the Wire, or Serpico, this model of policing that turns out to be the center of corruption in police work, and that was the reason why the force was cut back. The trouble is the police need to eat also, so along comes stop and frisk, and which in the trade in New York is called collars for dollars. that the production of new arrests involves 3 to 4 hours overtime pay, which contributes to your pension benefits. It's your highest earning years. Very, very evil kind of cycle associated with the profits to be made by various players in this system for keeping the thing very high. But New York State leads the way with 25% reduction in the prison population and in the arrests. And you can see that the red curve on the bottom is the drug offenders, and the blue on the top is the rest, and you can see that the proportions are shifting back to where they were, but the scale is still way up there. Do this. Okay, more fundamental reform, legalization of drugs. Colorado, Washington have legalized marijuana. If New York had done that, there'd be 50,000 fewer arrests last year. We had 50,000 marijuana arrests in New York City. That's for smoking a joint in the street, basically. Secondary prevention, reducing the harms of arrest, detention, imprisonment. And policing is front and center now, and there's a new movement within public health, harm reduction, associated with policing. We published 8 papers in the Journal of Harm Reduction last year about policing in Southeast Asia, where the police are signing on to AIDS prevention, which is really a big issue in Southeast Asia with injecting drug use, and want to be associated with public health. And we have an association that's based in Australia called the Center for the Law Enforcement and Public Health. I never thought I'd hear those 2 words in the same sentence before, those 2 phrases. But in fact, Gil Karakowski, the drug czar of the United States, showed up and was gushing about public health. And we're about to start a program of bringing police from countries that have done drug law reform, Australia and Britain notably, to the United States to talk to American cops about what they're doing. And Colorado and Washington are 2 target states, because even though the legalization of marijuana has gone ahead in those cases, it's by no means clear what's going to happen. The stop and frisk program, you know, in New York is the subject of enormous dispute at this point because of its racial specificity, justified on the basis of that's where the crime is, so that's where we go. And going up from 100,000 stop and frisks in 2003 to almost 700,000 last year, and amazingly finding the same number of guns every year. If you want to take an interesting epidemiological problem, try to explain that one. But this has been the subject of civil suits. Amanda Geller is here, who works with Jeff Fagan, who are looking at the lawsuits that are driving the response to this stop and frisk program. Oh, here's a statistic. Only 1.9% of frisks result in weapons of any sort being recovered. Another issue, solitary confinement. United States, 5% of the population, 25% of the prisoners in the world, 55% of those in punitive isolation in the entire world. The use of punitive isolation has grown with supermax prisons. Rikers Island will have people in detention. They want to. The prison guards are agitating there for more detention cells, and increasingly we come to understand years in isolation as being equivalent to traumatic brain injury. It's an engine for producing psychosis in people, and so we're beginning to call this torture. And we have an active program in the medical staff at Rikers Island to begin to document the harms that happen to people in isolation. What else to tell you about? Tertiary prevention, finally, because I have to stop. Tertiary prevention is, again, the chronic condition. People have been affected. How do you heal those wounds in some way, and how do you enable those people to have whatever life remains to them be a better life? And the truth and reconciliation processes that are at work in South Africa and Rwanda at this point, I think, are models of what can be done even under horrific circumstances. Taking Rwanda as an example, that if people understand that they're part of the same community, that they have to live together, that they are tied together by being citizens of the same country, and the leadership gives that message rather than there are people who are barely even people, which is, Khalil Muhammad's point in this, the development of the ability to write off huge chunks of the population, which people would rather were just not there. They would disappear them, as opposed to saying this is all one country and we're all part of that country. And it doesn't do us any value to systematically damage the life prospects of millions and millions of people who we're going to continue to live with. Jeremy Travis, president of John Jay, where I am, wrote a book called But They All Come Home. And I think the but is very significant because it indicates the role that people don't think they come home. Out of sight, out of mind. That was the prison. So let me stop at that point so we'll have time for questions. Thank you.